Hey everyone, Fresh here. This is kind of the second video that I'll be doing, breaking down some of the things you can do as a protection warrior to increase your damage or increase your survivability. Kind of just where you flex different things in order to get your numbers a little bit higher. So for this video, I'm going to be talking about gear, specifically secondary stats and trinkets, and because those are kind of the two things that will really determine, your kind of DPS gains or losses. The first thing I wanted to talk about before I kind of get into that is make sure you've got a good weapon. I do have a 639 weapon, so I've been using that. So basically just make sure you have as high an item level weapon as you can. That's your number one way to boost your damage. If you don't have a good weapon, craft one. Go out, farm 8, get gilded crests, make a 636 weapon, and that will 100% carry you basically with damage. But the other thing you can do is you can look at your secondary stats on your gear and your trinkets to determine some extra damage that you kind of get out of those. So the first thing I want to talk about is secondary stats and basically critical strike versus versatility. So haste is our number one stat, both offensively and defensively. So you should basically be trying to get as much haste as you can out of your gear. My current haste is it's over 18,000. Pretty much if I have an option to put haste on an item, then I will do it if I have that choice. Mastery is by far our worst stat, both offensively and defensively, so definitely just avoid this as much as you can. The two secondary stats that kind of have some tension is versatility and crit, and that's because crit is our best offensive stat, and versatility is our second best defensive stat, kind of behind haste. And I did some sims with basically two different rings. So I have this haste versatility ring here, and then I also have this crit haste ring. They're both the same item level, they're enchanted the same, they're gemmed the same. So the sim is about 8,000 DPS difference between the crit ring and the versatility ring. With the crit ring, you get a little bit more damage. So having, crit over versatility on one piece of gear is about 1% damage. Obviously, that's going to change based on crit values and how much crit you have. Like for example, like on several pieces of gear, you're not going to have that much secondary stats, right? Like so on like these shoulders, if these had, this only has 500 crit on it. So if it had 500 verse instead of 500 crit, it would not be 1% damage. It would be 0.25% or whatever. But when it comes to rings, generally speaking, because you have more secondary stats on here, wearing a crit ring means you're getting probably 1% damage, give or take. But in essence, if you want more damage off of your rings or your neck or anything like that, put crit on them. If you want more survivability, then you go for versatility. And versatility, so like this ring has close to 2,000 versatility, not quite, and that brings my current verse up to about 7.85% damage reduction. And if I drop that, then it goes down to 6.64%. So I'm losing a little bit more than 1% damage reduction for dropping versatility from my ring. So again, if you want a little bit more damage, I think this trade-off's totally fine because you gain about the same amount of damage as you do losing damage reduction, and 1% damage reduction from versatility is not a significant defensive loss compared to some of the talents I talked about in the first video. Anyway, so that was a lot of rambling. The TLDR is crit, more damage, versatility, more survivability. Now, the more important thing to talk about, or the thing that maybe people aren't sure about or they're confused about or anything like that, is trinkets. So first things first, everyone probably knows at this point, Sackbrood is going to be our best trinket. It has haste and primary stat on it, or proc's primary stat. It also has a very small damage proc on it. So this is just overall our best trinket. So definitely try to get at least a hero version of this. And if you get a myth version, awesome, like I've got here. But yeah, this will just kind of be your best overall trinket pretty much for the whole season. And I did actually sim the Sackbrood as well. And yes, it does do more damage than the other trinkets. Actually not by a surprising amount, but definitely enough to be noticeable. And then also the fact that you get the haste on it as well gives you that little bit of extra defensive value. So the trinkets I kind of want to talk about. The two primary trinkets I wanted to compare and contrast are going to be Skarmorak Shard and Swarmlord's Authority. I only have a 619 Swarmlord's Authority. I just got this out of like a time walking event, I think, one of the free dungeon cache or raid caches or whatever. But if you've got a higher item level Swarmlord's Authority, obviously these numbers will change a little bit. But when I simmed both of these trinkets, so simming a hero Skarmorak Shard versus a normal Swarmlord's Authority, the Skarmorak Shard does about 810,000 DPS, and Swarmlord's Authority does about 766,000 DPS. So you are looking at, over 5% DPS increase with Skarmorak Shard versus Swarmlord's Authority. But Swarmlord's Authority does have a lot of defensive value. When I've run this in keys before, it usually comes out to about 15% of my overall self-healing. So it does have a lot of defensive value. So definitely if you are, worried about your survivability, then you would want to run Swarmlord's Authority. One other thing to keep in mind with Swarmlord's Authority is since it has haste on it, it does have possibly some offensive value because it maybe will help you reach into the fray breakpoints where you can run into the fray comfortably and not have those gaps in your shield block up time, which then that damage increase you get from into the fray would make up for the damage loss in running Swarmlord's Authority versus Skarmorak Shard. So that is one thing to keep in mind with running this trinket as opposed to running like a high strength trinket with some sort of damage effect on it. Speaking of strength trinkets versus haste trinkets, out of curiosity, I was like, you know what? I'm going to sim a trinket with only strength on it and no other offensive value. So I simmed this combination of trinkets, basically Arakara Sackbrood and just a 3,000 strength trinket. And this trinket combination sims at 790,000 DPS. So it is 20,000 less DPS than running, a 626 Skarmorak Shard, but it is 25,000 more DPS than running Swarmlord's Authority. So that should kind of tell you just how valuable strength is when it comes to damage. So if you have ways you can get more primary stat, so if you have ways you can get more strength, run strength. It is always going to be like a really big damage bump for sure. And then I had some other trinkets here that I've kept in my bags that I kind of wanted to talk about. One, because some of these trinkets I know I've seen some warriors run. If you go look, like for example, like I was looking, I think it's u.gg. I was looking at their trinkets, and there are some warriors that run some of these trinkets, specifically Void Packstone. I think something like, it looks like maybe 2% of warriors run this. And then, also 2% of warriors run this Oppressive Orator's Larynx. So I kind of wanted to talk about these trinkets just because they do show up on some trinket tier lists for the spec. The first thing, let's talk about Void Packstone. Basically, this thing sucks. I've run this in dungeons before, and the damage proc is always less than 1% of my overall damage. The haste proc is pitiful. It's 800 haste, which is basically nothing. And when I sim this, so when I sim this trinket combination, the total damage is 795,000. So it's only 5,000 more damage than running a literal do-nothing strength trinket. So I don't think this trinket's super good. I would not recommend running this unless you literally had no other choice, but you probably have other choices, so I would just avoid running this. The other trinket that also has about the same amount of popularity as Packstone is this Oppressive Orator's Larynx. I actually like this one even less than the Packstone personally, and the reason is because you have no stats on it at all. You get the stats from proccing, like a buff basically, and obviously the more of the buff you have, the more strength you get, but I tried this a little bit, and generally it takes forever for this thing to proc. You don't proc right away, and so you're sitting there waiting to get like higher procs. And then the on use effect, you want to make sure you're using when you've got a lot of stacks of the, of the buff you're getting, but then you lose your primary stat. Overall, I don't like this trinket. And for Sims, it in theory does slightly more damage than Void Packstone. It does 798,000 DPS instead of 795,000 DPS. So, but that's with perfect play. I don't think I would play this perfectly. So my guess is that this might even be technically better than this in like a real world situation. Either way, I would not recommend running either of these trinkets. I think they're both awful. One trinket I do actually like, and the Sims actually bear out my kind of like feely craft on liking this trinket, is Spelunker's Waning Candle. So this trinket is just, it has primary stat on it, and then it procs crit. And then also you can also like kind of pass the crit off to like possibly someone in melee. But when I simmed this, it does about 800, 2000 damage. So it does more damage than Void Packstone and Oppressor Orator's Larynx. But it does do less damage than, Skarmorak Shard. Granted, this is a 626 versus a 619. But I think even if this was like a 619 Shard, I would think that the candle probably is still doing a couple thousand less DPS overall. So if you don't have a Skarmorak Shard or a Mark of Cardros, but you do have a Waning Candle, I think Waning Candle is a totally fine offensive trinket to run. Crit also does have some defensive value as well. Keep that in mind because it does give you parry. Granted, that's not like a huge deal for warriors, but it is there. It does give you something defensively, right? Whereas these trinkets basically don't do anything defensively. Like this gives you 800 haste, but I think 3000 crits probably even better defensively than 800 haste. I don't know, but anyways, yeah. So if you have Spelunker's Waning Candle and you don't have like a shard or anything like that, you can definitely run this. I think it's a totally solid offensive trinket to play. And then the last trinket, this isn't an offensive trinket. This is another defensive trinket. It's another Delve trinket, Silk Chain Weaver. I never play this, but I think it's viable to play. It's good when you're fighting versus like large packs of like mobs. In particular, like the first pull in Necrotic Wake, this could be very strong for sure. You get like 30 mobs that are all attacking you. You pop this, give them their 15% attack speed reduction, and hey, significant amount of damage reduction there. But overall, I don't like this. I don't think you really need it as a warrior, but it is a defensive option. If you don't have like a Swarmlord's Authority, you could run this. So, yeah. So anyways, that's just kind of me, like I said, breaking down just some like gear options and like trinket options. Obviously, I know there's more trinkets out there, and I don't have any other raid trinkets outside of Swarmlord's Authority. If you've watched any of my previous videos, I don't raid, I just do Mythic Plus. So all of my, gear is pretty much just going to come from Mythic Plus or Delves, or if I get really lucky and, open a trinket from a box for dungeons, then I'll get it that way. But for the most part, I don't raid. I don't deal with raid trinkets. But fortunately, I think this season, the Mythic Plus trinkets kind of outweigh the raid trinkets for the most part, outside of like Swarmlord's Authority. So, yeah. So that's kind of just a quick little like damage breakdown. I guess my TLDR overall recommendation is run Sack Brood and run Skarmorak Shard or Mark of Cardros. They're basically the same, so whichever one you have. Just run that trinket pair. Or if you want a really defensive trinket, run Swarmlord's Authority with Sack Brood. And then also run Swarmlord's Authority if the extra haste gets you to being able to run into the fray, then I would say run Swarmlord's Authority. So anyways, thanks everyone for watching. Remember, you can check me out over at twitch.tv/fridgetanking. I do stream my Mythic Plus runs over there, usually doing, 10 to 12 keys. So nothing crazy, but, keys that like definitely I think most people are interested in running. So feel free to check me out there. And thanks again, everyone, for watching.